All right. Well, welcome back to another episode of the Cybrary Studios podcast. Today in the studio, we have Ken Gilmour from Knogin here, the CEO and co-founder. Along with myself is Mike Gruen, our VP of Engineering. And today we'll be talking about cybersecurity strategy. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thanks.
Cool. Thanks.
So yeah, I don't know if you want to just give a little bit of background on yourself. That'd probably be helpful.
Yeah, sure. So I've been in the industry for about 20 years. I guess my career started after my enthusiasm. When I was a kid, I used to have a device from Spectrum called the M5, which was one of those old, rubber keyboard devices, kind of like the ZX80. Started there on BASIC, and then over the next couple of decades, I guess improved my skills. And I've set up a cybersecurity company called Knogin, as you mentioned correctly. And so we do, cybersecurity analytics and behavioral analytics.
So yeah, cool. When you think about sort of the strategy around cybersecurity, what are some of the things that you sort of take into account or think about?
So I think a few of the problems or mistakes that people make is that they look at it in silo. It's, they say this is a cybersecurity strategy, and yes, it is. But really it needs to be looked at holistically among the entire business, and not just, specifically for, just if it's a security incident, we deal with it. But, if your computer dies, we don't care about it because we're the security team. And why would you? But, ultimately, what you need to focus on is the people who are going through the incident process, and figure out how you can have a unified process for everything, and get everybody working together.
Yeah, I mean, I think here we have our facilities, everything sort of rolls up into me as head of security because all the systems are integrated. So everything from the door locks to what's happening on laptops and so on and so forth. So I feel like, because maybe in the small world that I live in, that things are moving in that way where there is more integration between the security teams. But I imagine you're seeing a much wider spectrum of the world, and maybe that's not quite happening as much as I think.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, what you have to think of is impact to your business. So a lot of people will, I guess you could call them purists. They would say you need to protect a system at any cost. And in some cases that might be true. You need to protect people's data and put whatever you can into protecting that data. But in the sense of most businesses, they look at it as kind of a cost value thing. So, if there's a system that's worth $10,000, they're not going to spend $1 million to protect that system because it's worth $10,000.
Right.
So they need to, make that profitable and kind of, ensure that how they protect it is, unified with the rest of the business. So, as you said, in facilities, if something is happening in the building, there is a process to follow. Even if it's just there's a fire, run out that door. That's what the process is, right? But there is a process for it, and kind of unifying that so that the facilities guy will usually know the people in the company who are responsible for specific things. And when doing that within cybersecurity, it's good to collaborate in those ways so that you can, I guess, understand who the right person is.
Right. Actually, I like that analogy because I worked at a company, pretty big company. We had lots of floors, and the way the fire thing was dealt with was there was a fire marshal per floor. They were just a regular employee that was given this additional designation of, hey, in the event of a fire, you're responsible for making sure X, Y, and Z happens. Potentially making sure all the offices are open and there's nobody in them, so on and so forth, and making sure everybody's, getting out. I could sort of see that same sort of applying to cybersecurity, where maybe it's somebody who's not specifically on the security team, but has some security responsibilities in the event of some sort of an incident, whether it be a physical incident or more of a virtual one.
Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, an incident, I guess I kind of played it down a bit, talking about the fire thing. So if there was a fire in this building, right, you would evacuate, but there are other processes in the background, such as how do we continue offering our service? How do we keep the business alive? And that is very kind of consistent with what you would do in cybersecurity as well. All of those things have to be thought through, and there are people in multiple parts of the business who think about that. So you as a cybersecurity person, you may know cybersecurity, you may be technical, do you understand accounting?
Right.
Do you understand the other parts of the business and how they work? Probably not. So that's why you talk to those people and help to understand their processes in order to bring it into your strategy.
Right. And so speaking of, sort of in the event of an incident or hacks or whatever you want to call it, what do you sort of think of with regard to the costs of a hack to an organization? I mean, there's obvious ones that people think of, but maybe there's some others.
Yeah, so I think in relation to small businesses, most small businesses just won't survive a hack. It's not because they don't have insurance. It's just because they lose trust, right? So you could have $10 million of insurance. Your hack might have cost you $1 million financially, but really you've lost the trust of your customers. And, once that happens, they're going to look at other people. They're not really going to have you on the top of their head anymore. The thing that they'll remember about you is that, oh, these guys got hacked and my data's gone. And, I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that happening again. So it doesn't matter what you have done afterward to clean up the problem. You've got hacked and you've lost your trust.
So how do you, and you alluded to it earlier, but it's that balance of, risk versus the data that you have to do some sort of risk assessment with regard to how much you're going to do to guard the data. I'm constantly asked that by, as we sell into enterprise customers, they want to know, like, what are we doing and how do we assess risk with regard to the data that we have? If I'm a small business, I imagine it's a lot harder to sort of think about. You also have all these systems like point of sale systems that maybe are managed by somebody else. Do you have any ideas around how a small business could go about sort of figuring out what they have and assigning risk?
So I think the real crux of the problem is the data that you collect. Everybody wants to collect so much data. So, at Knogin, when you sign up for a free account, you have your first name, your last name, and your email address. That's all we need. We don't care about anything else. Great if you're a CISO, great if you're, you've got a cool big job title. But to us as a company, why do we need that information? We don't, right? So the more information that you collect about people, the more you have to spend to protect it. Mm-hmm. And if that data is not, equated to money and value, then don't collect it. If you can't spend money to protect it, then you don't need it. And that's really the crux of the problem. A lot of people will collect a ton of data that's just completely unnecessary.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. What about also looking at the data that you're sort of collecting over time, just by nature of the type of business that they're in, not necessarily asking for, but like, hey, I'm a mechanic. Happens. I know when your car comes in for service, and I know, so there's just these records in general, and trying to figure out like how to assess how important is it for, from a security perspective, what's the risk of if that information were to get out or whatever?
Yeah, I guess that's quite a hard one as well. It really depends on what the information is, because really at the end of the day, the only thing a hacker wants is data, right? To you, that data is credit card numbers or, health insurance or something like that. For a mechanic, the information may be, good data that could be analyzed and, to figure out what types of customers they have and then steal your customers from you, right?
Right.
So there's a ton of different things that you could do with it, but it really depends on the context and whether you really should collect that data. In a lot of cases, you have to have the history of the car. You need to know, has it been in accidents and things like that for further sale, depending on where you are. But you just need to have appropriate security safeguards in place for that. You don't need to have the best in the world. I guess the analogy is like, two guys in a jungle running from a crocodile or a lion. Mm-hmm. You don't have to be the world's best athlete. You just have to be faster than the other guy.
Right, exactly, yep. I sort of feel like a lot of security is the same security that on college campuses with bicycles.
Yeah.
Your lock just has to be better than the bike lock next door.
Yeah, and your bike has to be slightly cheaper too.
Right, there's that too, right?
That helps.
Yep. In terms of like what you've seen, like for your own company, let me backtrack a little bit. How do I, as a small business, go about feeling more secure or doing those things? It's not like I can hire a full-time security person necessarily, depending on what business I'm in. What have you sort of seen as ways to sort of mitigate some of that risk or deal with that?
So I think awareness is a very important thing. So I know Cybrary offer a lot of awareness courses and things like that. So, I guess it's like, let's use an analogy of a car, right? So you could have the best technology in the world, right? Let's say, I don't know what the American equivalent is, but in Ireland, you get a Volvo, right? You've got your side impact protection, you've got your blind spot detection, you've got seat belts, all those kinds of things. But if you put a blind person in the driver's seat and send them on the highway, probably going to crash and somebody's going to get hurt.
Right.
And that's just the way it is. So you need to not only have good technology, and in fact, sometimes the technology doesn't even matter. What matters is the awareness that you have of the situation that's around you. So it's always most important to be educated about not only cybersecurity, but what the risks are to you specifically, to your data, to your organization, and even your competitors. What are the risks to them? Because they're probably risks to you as well.
Right. And then in terms of, one of the things I think people don't think a lot about is sort of the different ways places get, how hacks happen in a way, right? Everybody thinks of like very direct attacks, like, oh, my data is being stolen by somebody across the ocean. But there are other ways, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on like just sort of elaborating on some of the ways that companies.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think I guess one of the most important things is patch management, So a lot of people would come to me, and it's kind of hard to answer the question in an honest way, I guess, for a lot of business people. A lot of people will come to you and say, if there was one thing I could buy, that would protect me, what would it be? And you always want to say, oh, my product. But really, it's not that. It's patching, right? Mm-hmm. So when people get compromised online, oftentimes it's not a targeted attack. So let's say there's a vulnerability in WordPress. Some kid would know about this vulnerability in WordPress, and he would just scan the web for all the instances of WordPress that may have this vulnerability, may find a few, and then just compromise those sites. And that's generally how they get through it. So, if you don't patch your site, you will become, one of those bucket of compromised people or compromised sites. And that's generally how it happens. A lot of people worry about, maybe China or Russia is going to attack me, but for the average small business, literally just patch your systems and make sure they're up to date, and you'll avoid, a ton of problems.
And then as more and more small businesses, I think, are probably getting connected to whether it's software as a service or other small businesses, I think one of the other things is to sort of understand what those companies are also doing, because a lot of attacks sort of come in from the side, right? It's not a direct attack. It's my partner got compromised, which led them to getting into my network or got them my data, even if it's just because it's just data that I'm sharing with that partner. Yeah. I think that's one of those where a lot of people don't necessarily think as much about, like, when I enter into this relationship with this company, what are they doing to protect the data that I'm sharing with them? Or
that's right. Yeah. I mean, it's hard to know what a third party is doing, and even things like there was an organization I worked for about 10, 15 years ago, and they were basically I guess that they offered sysadmin services to us. So, what happened was they were compromised. Someone took an SSH key and then used that key to get into us. But to us, it looked like our vendor was connecting in and everything was fine, right? But we were compromised, and we detected it because the types of commands that the attackers used were different to the types of commands that our vendor used. But that's the only way we detected it. So, there's, I guess, the one thing you need to do is don't oversimplify, but also don't overcomplicate, because, attackers are persistent in some cases. And, if they know that you have a vulnerability, they'll just try to exploit it in multiple different ways. If they found that WordPress vulnerability and you've kind of made a slight modification to it, but not fully patched it, they may, find a way to actually, I guess, compromise it in a different way. So, don't make it too complicated. Simply just deploy the patch. Often it is the best way to do it. Mm-hmm. And just make it simple, but just not too simple. You have to have a way to monitor as well.
Right. I also think with data, one of the things that we really do to help is that with a lot of our partners, we share essentially anonymized data, right? There's some sort of unique ID that we assign to a user. We know how this maps, but then what we're actually sharing and getting back just uses that to sort of help eliminate risk of, if they get compromised, how much are they going to get? They're going to get some information about some user, but they don't necessarily know who that person is, and definitely want to limit the amount of sort of meta that we give about that person.
Yeah, exactly. You want to limit it as well and ensure that you control how they process it. But I mean, in many cases, they say 3 data points is all that you need to be able to identify an individual. And it's quite true. And, I think there was a problem with Best Buy a while ago, I guess probably several years ago, where they had, analyzed the shopping habits of one of their shoppers. And then they sent a package to that house saying, congratulations, you're having a baby.
Right.
Here's a bunch of, baby products. And turns out that this person was keeping it a secret from her father and didn't tell her father. And then he found out, after, these other companies had already realized it. So just from data analysis.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think in that case it might have been Target, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter, right? Yeah. It's just they have all this usage data, and they can sort of figure out. It's the sort of Cambridge Analytics type problem. And then I also, I heard it on the internet, so it must be true. But back when I think the US Census first released the census in a way that people could sort of search over it, it was sort of the same, they ran into the same problem that they didn't really consider, where if I put enough facets, if I put enough things, I could actually limit and figure out how much my boss makes, because I put in location, I kind of know enough meta information about it that I would actually be able to get the search down to returning one result.
Yeah, that's right. I think AOL did it as well with their search function. It's anonymized data. It's just kind of a number that's associated with a bunch of search queries, and you could identify people just from their search queries by associating that number.
Yeah. I think one of the best ways to deal with that is once a data set gets to a certain size, you don't return it. You say, sorry. I think that's how Census dealt with it, that they very quickly realized and fixed it. My apologies if that's not the case. I have a friend that works at the Census Bureau, so I got to.
Fantastic. Yeah. They're all great.
No, he didn't tell me the story. I definitely read it on the internet. Cool. In terms of ransomware and stuff like that, what are your thoughts on that in general? If I'm a small business or a large business, how do you sort of handle, what would your advice be for both mitigating it and then dealing with it if it actually does happen to you?
So, I think generally how ransomware works is, it will encrypt your files and then kind of delete the original files instead of kind of encrypting the new ones with the same name, because it's just easier to kind of make an encrypted copy and then delete the original copy. So, there's a bunch of ways that you could recover from it, but probably the easiest way for, small businesses, if you're using something like Box or Dropbox or G Cloud, G Suite, have version control enabled. Mm-hmm. So, if someone deletes a file, you can restore it. If they overwrite it, you just restore it to the last version as well. But you want to make sure you're not going to get hit by ransomware the same way as well. You want to be able to analyze and see how did it happen, and then just avoid that from happening again.
Right. My understanding is that in many cases, they actually lay dormant for 6 months, 9 months, a year before they actually trigger the ransomware, so that they know that they've sort of gotten your backups. Or even if they haven't, do you really want to restore back to 6 months ago versus, or maybe 9 months ago or a year ago? So I think there's even the backup approach, it's a great one. It still also has some limitations in what it can do.
So they've done that with websites as well. So they'll encrypt your database, and what they'll do is they'll add a key to an external website, and then in order to decrypt your database, you need to have that key. So they just kind of take it away and say, give me the money and I'll decrypt your database.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So this is why having a regular patching schedule is important as well. Yeah. But there are some cases where you can be fully patched, you can have up-to-date antivirus, and you can still get hit by ransomware as well. So you just need to, I guess, be able to deal with it from multiple angles, which is the strategy for incident management.
Yeah, definitely. I think last company I worked at, we sort of identified the weakest link is always the human link. It's always the person that's there. And that's where a lot of the stuff comes from. And so making sure people are aware and trained and understand the implications of decisions that they make.
Yeah, I think it's the human desire for resolving urgency issues, right? So when there's a problem, you just kind of do something to make the problem go away, instead of generally fixing it. So, you've got a problem on a server, you release a new piece of code urgently to fix that problem, but that code may be vulnerable because it hasn't gone through, the correct number of tests or QA or things like that too.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. Cool.
Oh,
there we are.
I feel like I've been dominating the conversation.
No, it's totally, it's been very interesting. Let's just kind of watching you guys go back and forth. But I mean, Ken, you're the CEO, and Mike, you're the VP of content or of engineering. How far in advance are you thinking of like the cybersecurity strategy? Like, how are you thinking of like, okay, this is what we can do now. We don't have the resources to do everything right up front, but like these are the things that we need to put in place at the moment, and then we can continuously upgrade and send people to training and things like that. Like, how is that something you mitigate as you start a business or start maybe with a smaller business as you're building and growing?
I think you need to start with yourself, and understand what you're doing, because, when you're starting up a business, you've got one person and then you've got your co-founder, and then you both have admin access to everything. And then, people obviously know you're the target because you set it up and you've got everything. And then as a business grows, you need to coherently divide that up, and then constantly just keep changing it as well, because people will change roles. You've got the accountant who also does HR and all of the other things as well, and then eventually it's just the accountant and someone else is doing HR, so that accountant no longer needs access to your HR data. And then you got to just keep kind of updating it and understanding yourself where things are, and then be prepared to be able to hand it over as you scale to someone else who could do the same.
Yeah, I definitely take the same approach here, where when I first joined, everybody had, it was a small company and a lot of people had a lot of administrative privileges. And the first thing I did was like make a list of, okay, well, what can I eliminate right away? And what can I work towards eliminating? Like, why do they need this access? And is there a suitable replacement, or do I have to build something, a solution? And then also in terms of more forward thinking, I usually think, I have a sort of general guide of where I'm going. That's maybe like 6 months, a year out. But it's mostly policy. It's try to keep it pretty loose and give good guidance of like what we want, and how, make sure that the people on my team, whether they're software engineers, data science, IT, whatever it is, infrastructure, that they have good information about like what I think is important and what we as a company think is important. And then they can make better decisions. I can't be involved in every single decision, and I can't dictate down. I need the people doing the work to sort of think through that stuff. So a lot of what I'm doing is really more around policy, or sort of that high level strategy of what do we want our posture to be? What do we consider the most important critical data that we need to protect? Where can we have maybe a little more risk? And then as the organization grows and I get more resources, then I can start addressing those other areas where in the past, maybe we were willing to take that risk, but now we're a more mature organization. We have to, we're getting into larger deals, and we're maybe dealing with more and more sensitive data. Or just more of the same data. So we become more of a target. So thinking through, definitely adding resources around that, and sort of a hiring plan that aligns with that sort of overall strategy.
Okay. Well, yeah, I think that is the time that we have today for this episode. So I just want to thank you, Ken, for being here, and Mike, thank you as well. Ken, we'll definitely have you back on in another episode coming up soon. So
great stuff.
Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thanks.
Thanks, sir.